Welcome back to Questing Beast, I'm Ben. This week my group decided to try out a game that I've wanted to try for a while, which is Draw Steel by Matt Colville and James Introcaso. I told my group I would run it for them even though I'm more of an OSR guy, because I genuinely enjoy trying out new systems, and I like a game with a strong tactical focus, which Draw Steel claims to have. Now, the tactical games that I tend to play are more board games than role-playing games, but that actually made me more interested to give this a try, because I wanted to see how it combined those different elements together. I also wanted to know how well the starter set for Draw Steel, which is called the Delian Tomb, functioned as a starter set. I was going to go in fairly blind. I know a little bit about how Draw Steel works, but as a new game master trying out this new system, how well does the starter set work to introduce game masters and players to the game? Today we'll be talking through my experience of prepping and then running my first session of Draw Steel using this starter set. What is the experience like of running this game? I'll also be going over some of the issues that I have with the system that you should probably be aware of if you're going to run it yourself, as well as the things that it does surprisingly well. Hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a very good sense of whether this system is right for you and for your players. However, before we get started, a quick reminder that this month I am giving away a different starter set, the Pirate Borg starter set and the new supplement Down Among the Dead, to one lucky subscriber to the Questing Beast newsletter. If you're not already subscribed to the newsletter, head down to the description below and check it out. It's completely free. It'll get you in the running for all of my giveaways, as well as getting you an awesome monthly newsletter that rounds up all of the cool things happening in the OSR and the RPG world that you may have missed. And secondly, this video is sponsored by my favorite apparel store, Into the AM. Starting on March 25th, they're going to have a store-wide sale of up to 60% off, which is a fantastic deal and is the perfect time to stock up on everything that you need for spring and summer. If you want to get a bunch of awesome graphic tees with fantasy or sci-fi themes, if you want to get button-down shirts or even jeans, now is the time to do it. All of the products that I've got from Into the AM have been absolutely stellar. I wear them all the time and I get compliments on them all the time. And if you thought that 60% wasn't good enough, use my link in the description below to get an extra 10% off of everything on their web store. Big thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring this video. And now let's get back into Draw Steel. So let's begin with some of the issues that I had with the Delian Tomb starter set. The first thing you notice when you open up the files that get sent to you when you buy it, because it's a digital only product, is that there are a lot of files in there. And in some ways, that's a good thing. You certainly get a lot of bang for your buck. It's a pretty large starter set. You have a lot of adventure content to run. You could run this for quite a long time, and that's really nice. But when you're introducing this game to a brand new game master who may not have run any RPGs before, or more likely has run 5e before, it can be a little bit intimidating when they see that, let's see here, the abridged starter rules document is 75 pages long. That's the abridged rules that are just for the starter set. The adventure itself is 70 pages long, and then there's a separate encounter book that's distinct from the adventure book that's 96 pages long. And note that the encounter book is distinct from the encounter sheets, which are sheets of paper that you need to print out to run with the encounter book in conjunction with the adventure book. And there's 43 of these sheets. And that's not even getting into all of the battle mats to print, a whole set of equipment cards that you can print and cut out to hand to your players, and the fact that every player gets a 4-page character sheet along with 4 pages of extra abridged rules. It's a lot. And even as an experienced game master, I was feeling a bit overwhelmed looking at all of this. Where did I start? What did I need to focus on? What could I set aside for later? What did my players have to read to be ready to play the game? And most importantly, how long was this going to take for me to prep? Now, reading through the beginning of the adventure book did help orient me a bit. I decided to just set aside all of the battle mats. I would just use my wet erase giant mat that I have, and I would just draw the different situations and encounters directly on that. Same with the equipment cards. I decided to just ignore those. I would tell the players what items they got if that ever came up in play. And fortunately, I'm in a group with a very active, engaged group of players, most of whom are game masters. And they enjoy digging into new systems, and they like helping out the game master, which was really helpful. A lot of them went online and watched videos explaining the basics of the rules. Some of them read all of the rules before we even began, which is super awesome. So big shout out to all of them. The materials do recommend that everyone reads the 75-ish pages of rules before you get started. And I agree that would be ideal, but it's just not really realistic. Like I mentioned before, every player does have a 4-page character sheet. Well, really it's 3 pages because one of them is just a big portrait that has all of their special abilities on it. And then they have a 4-page a list of all of the essential rules, and really that's all you need to get going. But for a group of players that are used to lighter systems or more casual play, this could still be kind of a lot. Draw Steal is a very tactical, kind of chess-like game that assumes that players are going to be very involved in understanding the rules and using all of their abilities, creating combos with other players, working together to overcome enemies in the most tactically efficient way possible. And if your group of players is really more casual and is there to just hang out and chat and roll a d20 every once in a while to hit a goblin, then they're probably going to have a bad time. For groups like mine that are really into it, though, they said that the character sheets were very well organized, they were very easy to understand, no one felt overwhelmed by all of the options there. However, the way that the adventure is presented to the game master, or the director as it's called here, was a bit of a different story. Eventually, reading through all the documents, I kind of figured out how they were supposed to work. And I discovered that to run the adventure, you need to have between 3 and 5 different documents open all at the same time, and then you have to switch back and forth between them as needed to run the adventure, which is one of the wildest setups that I've ever seen, especially for a starter set. The vast majority of starter products out there have at most 2 documents, one for the adventure and then one for the rules, although there's many cases where everything is actually combined into a single book. In Draw Steal, the adventure book does not actually contain everything you need to run the adventure. The focus is really more on introducing concepts one at a time, both to the game master and to the players, and an extended amount of read aloud text where it tells you what to tell the players as you introduce each concept and each new encounter. Honestly, this is a pretty good way to do it, especially for people who are very unfamiliar with RPGs. It gives them a lot of confidence that they're not missing anything as you proceed through. Although that being said, you might want to read all of this ahead of time and process it and try and put it into your own words, because a lot of players are probably not going to enjoy multiple pages of read aloud text, which is what is required sometimes. The bigger issue comes up when you try to actually run a combat encounter, which is really the centerpiece of a Draw Steal campaign. The adventure book does not have everything you need in there, especially it doesn't have things like monster tactics, and it doesn't have any of the monster stat blocks. To get all of that, you need to turn over to the encounter book, which is a whole separate thing, and then all that information will be in there. Why it's all in a separate book is a total mystery to me. If the book ever explains it, I missed it. I don't know why they did it, and I found it very annoying when I was reading through the adventure and while I was running it. But that's not all you need. To run an encounter, you also need the correct encounter sheet. And this is something that I think was intended to be kind of like a one-page control panel for helping you run the combat at the table. For example, it has information in the middle of it explaining how malice works in this encounter, the different things that game masters can spend this GM resource on to make the monsters more powerful. And then down at the bottom, it has a list of all the different monsters that are going to be in that encounter, along with a hit point tracker so you can write on it how damaged they are. But this sheet is missing all of these stat blocks, so you can't run the combat just off of this sheet. You have to have it open with the encounter book, and then you have to have the adventure book open too, because that has important read aloud text for things that could happen during the combat. It includes information around the combat that comes up before and after, and sometimes in the middle of it. Also, when it comes to rules, sometimes the rules are explained in the adventure book as part of the read aloud text. Sometimes the encounter book gives you tips on how to use some of the rules. And sometimes they are on the rules summary, the 4-page thing that the players get. And if you can't find on any of those, you have to turn to the main full starter rules and look it up in that document. These documents don't always sync up properly either. For example, the concept of malice is introduced in the second encounter in the adventure book, but it shows up on the first encounter sheet, which is going to be very confusing for game masters that haven't read all the way through. And on top of all of this, unless you're planning on printing out multiple 70 to 90 page books, you're going to be running all of this on your laptop, which I was doing. And the formatting of all of these books is in standard 8.5 by 11 2-column format, which is too large of a page to really fit on a laptop screen. You have to zoom in and then scroll up and down and move from column to column to read things on one document. And then you're doing this on multiple documents at the same time. Now, all that being said, once you read all of this information, at least for the beginning section of the adventure, the overall structure of what the players will be doing is not too hard to understand. It's kept pretty simple. It's just a bunch of fairly simple combat encounters with a little bit of elements added in there to allow for some player creativity, which we'll see when we get to my experience running it. But there is one final issue, though, which may be an issue for some people and not others, and that's that this is a very miniature-heavy game. That's not a big deal. In principle, I like miniature games. I have a huge, big collection of them, but even I did not have enough miniatures for some of these encounters. The second combat encounter has about 24 goblins that the players are fighting, and that was way more goblins than I have. I swapped out some of them for kobolds and orcs and stuff like that, which is totally fine. But most people aren't going to have that many miniatures, period. Of course, you can swap into things like tokens or even little scraps of paper if you want, but just be aware of the amount of material that's going to be required here. All right, so what was the experience like of actually playing the game? Well, the first thing we did was pick our characters from the pre-generated character sheets, and these were all very interesting. They were very flavorful. One nice thing about the character sheets is that it introduces all of the different character abilities kind of one at a time. Every time you go to a new encounter, a new set of abilities unlocks, so you're not overwhelmed with everything all at once, and the player said that they like that. The inciting incident is pretty generic. You're in a tavern, a woman barges in and says that her daughter has been kidnapped by goblins hiding in a tomb, and you're off to the races. I skimmed over a lot of the read aloud text and just summarized it myself because I wanted to get into the action as quickly as possible, which is really the main feature of this game. The 4 characters we ended up using was Gwen, the Elementalist. We had Maurus, the Null, which is like a monk. We had Thundar, the Fury. And then finally Kronk, who is an orc conduit. The first encounter was in a grassy field right outside the tomb. And one of the things I really liked about this encounter, which was very simple and straightforward, was despite how complex a lot of the character sheets looked and how complex some of the rules seemed, the game actually flowed really quickly. Way more so than I've seen in even games like Pathfinder and Pathfinder 2e, which also seem fairly complex. And I think a big part of that is that the game very intentionally removes a lot of the rolls. For example, there's no rolling for initiative and there's no turn order. Whoever is going to go first in the combat is decided mostly by the circumstance. Usually the players are defaulted to going first, and then one player character goes and does all their stuff, and then one monster or a group of monsters does their stuff, and then another player goes. Which player goes next is completely up to the group. Or if they can't decide, you can just go around the table in a circle. It doesn't really matter. This means that there's no sitting around and waiting for your turn. There's no forgetting what the turn order is and you having to remind them over and over. Instead, it's just the player's turn. They all look at each other and say, who wants to go next? Who has a good move? Can you do something to help me here? Can you combo off the move that I just did? And then you just go. Also, there's really no rolling for damage. Instead, basically how it works is you roll 2d10, and then you add a bonus, usually a small bonus, like 1 or 2, from one of your abilities. And then that result gives you one of 3 different success tiers, and these tier ranges are always the same. Importantly, each of these tiers does a flat amount of damage, so you never have to do the second step of rolling for it. And you never have a situation where everyone is just rolling low damage and there's no progress being made. There's a sense of high impact for everything that the players do. The combat is always moving forward towards a conclusion, which I really enjoy. There isn't even any saving throws in the traditional D&D sense. Like maybe you do an attack and you get a tier that also inflicts a condition like bleeding on an enemy. Well, how do you know if that bleeding is going to apply to them? In D&D, you would make like a strength or a constitution saving throw. And in this game, what it does is you just check and see if their abilities are high enough to resist it. So if you do it against a person and they say, oh, my might is 2, you say, oh, that's quite high, so the bleeding just doesn't apply to you. It's very binary and very fast. But let's say you do get a condition like bleeding. How long is it going to last? In D&D, again, you would have a saving throw where you're rolling dice, adding a number, trying to get a difficulty class. But in Draw Steel, you don't have to do any of that because there's always a 50-50 chance that any condition is going to end at the end of your turn. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to wonder which ability is this saving throw keyed to. It's just always 50-50. You always know what to do. It seems like in Draw Steel that whenever the designers had an option between a more realistic, granular way of doing something or a way that was simpler and more impactful, they always chose the second one. Although as a game master, I was a little annoyed by all these documents that I had to flip back and forth between as I was trying to run the game, the players really took to the system like a fish to water and began hammering goblins like nobody's business. One thing I don't like a whole lot in standard D&D is how when combat starts, everyone just rushes up to an enemy and then they just hammer each other one at a time over and over until one of them drops. And there isn't a lot of dynamism inside the fight, and that's definitely not the case in this system. A big thing in Draw Steel is that it's really designed to have a lot of pushing and throwing of the enemies around. How the actions work is that you have a movement action, and then you have a maneuver, and then you have an attack. So you're really incentivized to try a combat maneuver every round. And pretty quickly, the players found out that one of the best maneuvers is the one that shoves an enemy backwards. If you shove them into a wall, it does extra damage to them. If you shove them into another enemy, then they both take damage. This led to some really funny situations. Like at one point there was two goblins next to each other, and then one of them got slammed into his friend by one of the PCs. Then the PC teleported to the other side of them and slammed the second goblin back into the first one again, just ping-ponging them back and forth. During the first encounter, I was pretty bad at remembering that my goblins should also be doing maneuvers, but eventually I got the hang of it. I really like combat maneuvers in combat, and it's great to see a system that puts so much of a focus on that. And it was during the first combat that I realized that the players are really powerful. I was throwing a bunch of goblins at them. I think there was like 8 or so during the first encounter, and they were just annihilating them. The players really are fantasy superheroes, so it feeds into that fantasy if that's what the players want. When it came to tracking everything in the combat, I was supposed to be using the combat encounter sheet and using it to track by hand the number of hit points that each of the goblins had. I decided not to do that. That's just a lot of work behind the scenes to do, and it slows the game down and takes me out of the fight. And all of the goblins kind of look the same, and it's very easy to lose track of which goblin on the battlefield matches the guy that's on your list. It becomes very just muddled after a while. So my solution was just to do away with secret hit points entirely. Instead, anytime a goblin was injured, we just took a d20 and we put it next to the goblin to show how many hit points it had left. So the players just got to keep track of all of that, and I didn't have to worry about a thing. Players could see how many hit points a goblin had left, and that helped them make tactical decisions about which guy they were going to attack first, who was in most danger, and things like that. Now, of course, the downside is that it removes some of the mystery of how injured a particular goblin is. But the benefits were so huge that the trade-off is just easily worth it for me. It speeds up the game so much. And actually, I think it's kind of justifiable. If these are all experienced fantasy superheroes, then it's perfectly reasonable to say that they have a very good sense of how injured an enemy is that they're fighting. Honestly, I'm probably going to start doing this in all of my RPG games when there's a lot of monsters on the field and I don't feel like keeping track of all of them. It was just so freeing and it made the game so much faster. Strongly recommend that everyone else try this too, just to see how it feels. Now, after beating all these goblins to a pulp, our Fury grabbed one of the remaining ones, slammed him up against a wall, and started interrogating him. I needed to know what the goblins knew about what was going on in the tomb, and it turns out that information was in the adventure book, not in the encounter book or on the encounter sheet. So we had to switch to that to give the players the lowdown that there was an evil ritual going on down below where the girl was going to be sacrificed to open up some of the lower levels of the tomb. So there was a ticking clock. The players decided to sneak down into the tomb to hopefully ambush any goblins there, but the goblins knew that they were coming. This second encounter was one that I was a lot more worried about because there's around, like I said before, 24 goblins in this, and it sounded like it was going to be a huge pain to run. However, this became a lot easier to run once I realized how the squad mechanics work. You have minions in Draw Steel, which is a certain type of monster, and you can organize them into squads of up to 8 of these minions, often with a leader. This whole squad operates as a single unit. They go all at once when it's their turn to go. And when you attack, you do a single attack roll, and then attack roll applies to all of them at the same time, which saves you a lot of time rolling. Now, the most effective way to actually use a minion squad is to have them each attack a different character. You don't want to actually gang up against one character. You can do that, but you're going to be doing less damage overall because when you gang up against one guy, each of the goblins or minions isn't going to be doing their full attack. They just add a little bit of extra damage to one attack against that character. It is a little odd, though, how these mechanics encourage you to split up these squads and kind of spread them out around the battlefield, because this does create another wrinkle in the game system. This is especially the case as in the second encounter, which I was running, where you have multiple squads, 4 different squads, in fact. If all of these squads are splitting up and going different places on the battlefield, then when it's one squad's turn to go, it becomes very hard to keep track of which minion belongs to which squad because they're all spread out everywhere. Now, there are solutions to this. You can put like little colored rings on the bottom of the minis if you have those. If you're using tokens, you can create color-coded tokens and things like that. But it is just another thing to keep track of. Also, to simplify how a squad works, they have a shared pool of hit points. So if one goblin has, say, 5 hit points and there's 4 goblins in this squad, then there's a pool of 20 hit points. And every time that pool is decreased by at least 5, whenever you go down by an increment of 5, then one goblin simply dies. Now, this makes a lot of sense when you have a group of goblins all in one place, because if a character, I don't know, does a lot of damage, does like 10 damage, you can say, oh, your sword slices through one goblin and then chops off the head of another or something like that. It becomes a lot more strange when your squad is spread out all over the place. Because if you do a whole bunch of damage to this one goblin in one corner of the room, why is it also killing a goblin that's 30 feet in a different direction? Now, this didn't affect the encounter so much while I was running it, because I tried to keep things really simple and I just kept each of the squads together, so it was very easy for me to keep track of where they were. But this wasn't the tactically optimal way for me to do it. The room that we were fighting in had a big fire pit in the center of it, which is clearly there so that you can push PCs or goblins into it. And there was a bunch of pillars that you could smash people into. And we did end up using that in a number of different ways. But while I was planning out what I was going to be doing, the players got to go first, and the Fury rushed across the battlefield, encountered a squad of goblin archers at the back of the room, and then killed all of them in a single hit. The player character started being able to do moves like this because over time they had been building up this personal heroic resource, which has a different name for each class. And as you build up this meta currency, you can spend it on doing really powerful moves. Actually, there's a bunch of different meta currencies in the game. Every time you win a battle, you gain a victory, which you then can convert into XP when you rest. There's also something called surges, which give you bonuses that you can spend. You have recoveries, which you have to keep track of, and you can spend those to heal yourself. There's also hero points, which is like a pool of tokens that every one of the PCs can borrow from to do extra stuff. And of course, the Game Master has a meta currency called Malice that builds up over time so that he can do super moves with the monsters. Definitely a very meta currency heavy game. So if you have a huge problem with that, you might not like this. Normally, I'm not a big fan of meta currencies, but the game was so, I don't know, board game-like and so focused on the tactics that it was already kind of abstracted, and I didn't really mind it all too much within this context. At this point, I was realizing that the players were way more powerful than I expected, so I decided to not take it easy on them and just try to kill them as much as possible. However, a combination of me not using the goblins as tactically efficiently as possible and some bad rolls meant that I wasn't really able to take any of them out. But I think I put on a decent show. I tried to use some of the goblins to do big push moves to shove the players back into the fire pit to do some extra damage. I thought that would be really fun, but I didn't roll all that well. And several of the player characters have a ability called stability that prevents them from being pushed very far. So that was kind of a wash. I did manage to maneuver some of my remaining goblin archers to start pincushioning some of the weaker player characters, especially the magic users, but efficient use of the conduit, who's like the cleric class, managed to keep their health up high enough that no one actually died. I did spend some of my malice points a few times to try and do some more dangerous attacks from the larger goblins, but it wasn't quite enough to take the players out. In retrospect, I think what I should have done is waited for longer, allowed more malice to build up, and then done some of the really powerful malice moves. Like there's one where the whole area gets filled up with goblin stink. I think it's just goblin farts. It's unclear, but I think that's the implication. And I think that would have been a lot of fun to try. Meanwhile, the Elementalist was running around and setting people on fire. The Fury kept leaping from group to group and just obliterating them with super moves. So before long, that was, well, the end of all my goblins. We ended up ending the session there. It had been about 3 hours. We spent about an hour picking characters and getting set up, and then an hour approximately for each of the different encounters. But it felt like it had gone by pretty quickly. Even though combat, I guess, takes longer overall than it would in an OSR game, it was consistently interesting. You felt like you were making impactful choices and things were happening. You never felt like things were stalling out. And my players confirmed that the game succeeds at what its main goal appears to be, which is to make you feel like a badass superhero. Overall, the players were really jazzed by the whole experience. They definitely wanted to finish the dungeon, and one of them even mentioned that he would like to play a whole campaign of Draw Steel as well, although I don't know if I'm up to running that. It's definitely more of a board game-like experience than an OSR game is. It's definitely peak combat as sport rather than combat as war. So far, I think that combat was actually maybe more entertaining for the players than it was for me. And I think a big part of that is that they have these elaborate character sheets with all these special abilities and all these interlocking powers that can be comboed in different ways, and that's a lot of fun to use. Whereas running a big room full of goblins is a little bit less interesting, although the goblins did have powers that you could use. I would be very interested to try a combat where instead of running just a ton of minions, I had a smaller number of more powerful villains that had more interesting special abilities that I had to combine together. But the thing that was hardest for me to get over is just how it's organized for the game master. I've never seen an RPG that broke the information that you needed into so many different pieces that you had to search for and scroll through in order to get what you needed to run something. There has got to be a better way to do this. And I think if the information was reorganized along those lines, it would be much easier for new game masters to get into. The game has clearly been heavily play tested and is a lot of fun for the players. I just wish that that same amount of focus had been put into usability for the person running the game. So that's my review for the Draw Steel starter set. Let me know down in the comments below if you have played this system, what your experience was, and what you liked most about it, and what you think should be improved. Remember to subscribe to the newsletter if you want to get in the running to win my copy of the Pirate Borg starter set. And thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.